It's all too easy when songwriting to default to some of the most basic version of chords over and over again, when even taking a little effort to slightly spice up those chords would actually go a long way. So in this series so far, we've actually covered how to spice up the tonic chord or the 1 chord and the dominant chord, the 5 chord. But in this video, we are going to be talking about how to spice up our major 4 chord. So if you don't know what I mean by this whole numbered chords thing that I just mentioned, like 1 chord, 5 chord, 4 chord, what the heck does that mean? All it means is that it is a reference to a chord in context of a key. So for example, if we are in C major, the 1 chord would be C major. It's just always the chord that the key is named after. And then our 2 chord would be going up to D, which is D minor. And then our 3 would be up to E minor. And then our 4 chord would be F major. 5 chord would be G major, etc. Now, for all major keys, it is always true that our 1, our 4, and our 5 chords are always going to be major. And then our 2, 3, and 6 will always be minor, and our 7th will be diminished. Now, the reason I think the numbered chords are very important, and I would even argue more important than their named counterparts. So for example, in the context of C major, thinking of our F major chord as a 4 chord rather than an F major chord is because the 4 chord informs us of the overall sound in context of the key of that chord and the job of that chord in the context of the key. Because an F major chord in the context of C major has the same role as a G major chord in D major and an A major chord in E major. And even if you think something like, oh, major chords sound nice, E major chords sound good. Well, sort of, but in context of, say, C major, all of a sudden, it doesn't sound quite how you expect. Now, certainly you can do that. That would be a borrowed chord of a sort. Overall, the main idea here is we are just talking about any chord that is a 4 chord in a major key. So if your song is in C major, we're talking about an F major chord. If your song is in D major, we're talking about G major chord. If your song is in E major, we're talking about an A major chord. If your song is in G major, then C major would actually be your 4 chord. So the first way to spice up your 4 chord is simply to change up the inversion. So far in this series, I've actually started all the videos with, hey, change up the inversion. But that's because I think it's one of the easiest ways to really spice up any chord that is just super simple for anyone to do. So if you're going to start with anything, this is a great place to start, is simply changing up the inversion. But it's going to be a little bit different for every chord in context. I think the inversions and what inversions can get you for, say, the major 1 chord versus the major 4 chord are a bit different. So it's worth talking about them for each. So overall, what really is an inversion? An inversion is just any time that you have a chord and the note in the bass is not the root of the chord, but is actually one of the other notes from the chord. So for example, in our F major chord, normally by default, you would have F in the bass because F is the root of an F major chord, G is the root of a G major chord, etc., whatever the name of the chord is. But the other notes in our F major chord are F, A would be another note, and C. So our first inversion would be with the 3rd in the bass, which would be an A. And our second inversion would be if we have the C in the bass. Other ways to look at this, if you're not a pianist, would be, for example, you could have a G major chord that a guitarist is playing, but the bass is actually playing a B. In that case, that would be first inversion because your G major chord has a G, a B, and a D. So the B is the 3rd, which would make it a first inversion when the bass guitarist is playing a B along with your G major chord. So overall, let's talk first inversion first. I think first inversion gets us something pretty cool in that it's a great way to darken up our 4 chord because a 4 chord by default is a very, very bright chord. It's a major chord, right? That's our 1. That's our 4 chord. Yay, it's so bright. 1, 4, 5, 4, 1. It's all so bright, right? But if you actually just put the A in the bass, it darkens it up quite a bit. Now, the reason for this, I think, is because overall, if you're going to weigh how much each note influences what chord something is really, the bass note has more say than any other note. Just to illustrate with an example, if we have a C sus2 chord, which would be our C, a D, and then a G, and we have C in the bass, it is basically indisputably just a C sus2 chord. But if we change the inversion, technically, by having the G in the bass, which technically is an inversion because that is naturally occurring in our C sus2 chord. But at this point, really the chord has evolved into a G sus4 chord. So seeing it a different way, if we take this G, put it down here, it's a little easier to see. Oh, yep, that's a G sus4 chord. So just by changing the bass note, we changed fundamentally what the chord was. And the reason for that is really just that it weighs a little bit more than all the other notes in determining what a chord is really. So I mention all that just to illustrate this concept I'm about to talk about, which is when we have that first inversion with the A in the bass, now we have that A and the C from our F major chord that are sort of given extra attention to. And those are our first and our third of our A minor chord. So yes, we don't have that fifth from the A minor chord, but we're really putting quite the emphasis on this minor third. So overall, it really just darkens up our F major chord while keeping it technically an F major chord. So next we have second inversion, which is the fifth in the bass. So in our 4 chord, that actually means that we're going to have the 1, the tonic of the entire key in the bass. Now this gets us several pretty cool things. One is that it's an easy way to have a pedal tone. If you don't know what a pedal tone is, basically it's just when we have one note that keeps being held over a long period of time. So this would be an example of pedaling on the tonic. We have a C major chord, and then we have a G major chord, but with a C in the bass, and then an F major chord with C in the bass. That would be an example of pedaling. We just kept that C consistent. Now, technically, it doesn't have to be the bass note, but most often it is the bass note. So when we utilize our 4 chord with our second inversion, we're keeping that 1 in the bass, which can be utilized sort of as a double down on what often is done with a C sus chord. We talked about this in our video about spicing up the 1 chord, where a great way to spice up if you're on a 1 chord for a while and you really do need that first and the fifth for whatever the melody is or for whatever reason. A great way to mix it up to not make it unbelievably boring is to throw in like, oh, there's a sus4 now. That's a great way to spice it up. So you can look at the second inversion of our F major chord as just doubling down on that. Because if we look at it, our C major chord or our 1 chord, we have these notes, right? So if you move up the third to a 4th, that gets us our 1 suspended 4 chord. In this context, C sus4. Then if we move the 5th up by 1 note, now we have our 4 chord. But we kept the same bass note, so it's technically the second inversion. So instead of, you can go. So sort of doubling down on the same concept. The next way to spice up your major 4 chord is to utilize an add or sus2 chord. Now, the reason for this is that your 4 chord already has the tonic from your key, which is great. But if you have a sus2 or an add2, you're adding that G, which is the dominant. So that means in your 4 chord, you actually have both the tonic and the dominant, which are the 2 most important notes that you have in a major key, or in any key for that matter, is your 1st and your 5th. Another thing that you get is most often the sus chords or the add chords you want to use are ones that avoid having a minor second interval. Now, it depends, and it's going to depend on genre and how pretty versus how not pretty you want the sound to be. But generally speaking, if we take, just as an example, instead let's do a sus4, you get that gnarly interval, which is a minor second. And a minor second, very, very dissonant and jarring. But a major second is less so. So minor second, major second. There's still dissonance, so it's not overly pleasant and overly sweet sounding, but it's not quite as overtly dissonant as our minor second. So in our add 2 chord, we're adding that G, and there still is just major second at the smallest for intervals. So it ends up having this very pretty sound that's not like overly saccharine and sweet, because it's got It's got some dissonance in there. So not only is this a very pretty add chord or very pretty sus chord, but it's something that really hammers home some of the most important notes in the context of your key. Because just to take the sus chord as an example, we have the 4, the 5, and the 1 of the key, which are the 3 probably most important tones, most foundational tones in the key. I guess you could argue for the leading tone in some senses, but overall, probably the 3 most important notes that you have in a key, and they're all in one chord for our sus chord. And then, arguably, the 4th most important tone, although it might even be the 5th, because maybe the leading tone's more important. But now you have the root of all 4 of your most common chords. You have your 1 chord, your 4, your 5, and your 6 chord. All those notes in one chord. So overall, not only is an add or sus2 specifically on a 4 chord a very, very pretty chord, but gives you a lot of the important tonalities that you want from any major key. And another way to spice up our 4 chord is to actually utilize a borrowed chord instead of our naturally occurring major 4 chord and actually use a minor 4 chord instead. This is probably the most common borrowed chord of all borrowed chords. One great use for it is simply to replace your major 4 chord with a minor 4 chord, because this will take an otherwise very predictable chord progression. Let's take the most predictable chord progression of all, or 1, 5, 6, 4. By the end, you were like, yep, I know how this ends. But if we just swap out our major 4 at the end for a minor 4, we would get this. Now, all of a sudden, there is a surprise at the end. But probably the most common way to use it is to actually go from the major 4 to the minor 4, and then pretty often you would resolve it to the 1. But another great way to use it would be major 4, minor 4, 5, major 5 specifically. A part of the reason that I think this is utilized a lot and what makes it super powerful is it gives you something called chromaticism. Chromaticism is really just a series of half steps, really. So any major or minor key only has one interval of a half step in a row. So just to take C major, for example, because we've been utilizing it a lot, we have whole step, half step. So there's our minor second. Half step, minor second are the same. But then it's back to a major second, whole step, half step. And that's a whole step again. So in any major or minor key, we are never going to have a naturally occurring series of 3 or more half steps. So if we start with our F major, we have our C, our F, and then our A. And then to F minor goes to A flat, which is down a half step. And then when we resolve it to C major, that goes down another half step from A flat or G sharp. But in this context, we would consider A flat down to G. And we also get that effect from going to the 5 chord. So overall, that chromaticism is what gives it that distinct sound. And overall is what makes it something that is one of the more commonly used borrowed chords and is a great way to spice up your 4 chords. So whether it just comes in as a surprise replacement for your major 4 chord, or whether you actually almost resolve your major 4 down to a minor 4 before truly resolving it on a 1. I don't know why I use the term resolve. It's really not resolving on a minor 4 that's not naturally occurring in the key. But regardless, utilizing that borrowed minor 4 chord can be the way to go. By the way, if you didn't know how I got to that, literally just take your 4 chord, which is going to be major, and then flatten the 3rd, aka take the 3rd of it, which in this context would be A, and bring it down by a half step. That's it. So if we were in D major, which means our 4 chord would be our G major, then you would just take the B, which is the 3rd, and flatten it. So that would be the equivalent in D major. So hopefully this was helpful to you. If it was, something else you'll definitely find helpful is my free guide on the 4 pillars of music theory that I think every single songwriter really needs to know. Stuff like this is a bit of a deeper dive that I think is super useful, but overall what you absolutely must know are intervals, because intervals is sort of at the basis of everything. In fact, I utilize intervals to explain some of what I was talking about, right? So when I said half steps or minor second interval, when we were talking about why this sounds pleasant versus that, or the chromaticism, that was half step. So everything is built off of intervals. So once you understand intervals, basically almost everything else music theory starts to come together. But then learning keys, chords, and chord progressions. And we're talking about chords in the same context we were in this, which is really from a high overall perspective, which is looking at things as 1 chords and 5 chords rather than just C major and G major, because ultimately C major in and of itself is not very informative. It matters based on the context of the key, because a C major in G major has a very different job than C major in C major. So that's where the numbers are important, because if you understand the numbered version of the chords, then you understand, oh, my C major chord in G major has the role of a 4 chord, but in C major it has the role of a 1 chord, which means that in C major, a C major chord is basically the same as what a G major would be to a song that is in G major. So anyway, those are the 4 pillars. If you understand those 4, that is what will really allow you to be way more efficient and way more effective at specifically music writing, so that instead of sort of just sitting and hoping that your improvisation can come up with a cool riff that actually works, instead you know what works. You just understand, okay, I'm in the key of D major, so I know that the notes I have are D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, and then back to D. And you also know, okay, in that context, I have my 1 chord, my root, the chord that my song wants to resolve to. That's a D major chord because I'm in D major. And I understand that the chord that most badly wants to resolve to that D major is going to be my A major, because my A major in the context of D major is my 5 chord. And I know that 5 chords always want to resolve to the 1 chord the most. 4 chords also resolve very well to the 1 chord, but they don't beg to quite as much as the 5 chord. So learning the basics of music theory can go an incredibly long way. Yes, I think it's also helpful to learn slightly more advanced things like modes and borrowed chords and sus chords versus add chords and 7th chords. That all is super useful as well. But the most basic thing that you truly need to learn are these 4 pillars. Go check it out. Totally free at songwritertheory.com/music theory guide. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I'll talk to you in the next one.